There's no question, whatever. I know there's some dispute about the specific numbers, but what unfolded yesterday was unquestionably a massacre. We have seen the images of the bodies of children littering the streets. We've seen the horrific scenes of the hospitals of weeping parents and bloody children. And to look at an incident of that scale, to see that many casualties and to celebrate this as any kind of success is effectively to say that the lives of Israelis are more valuable than the lives of Palestinians. That is the only way anybody can celebrate this as a success. Now, it's unsurprising that that's the view of the Israeli government. They've made it absolutely clear that they don't value Palestinian lives at all, not just throughout this campaign of assault on Gaza over the past several months, but Israeli policy towards Palestinians for much, much longer. What has been disappointing is the way our government also has reduced the massacre to a footnote and focused primarily on the retrieval of hostages. And Frederica, all you have to do is just imagine the reverse scenario. Right now, as we speak, there are thousands of Palestinians who have been kidnapped out of Gaza, placed in Israeli detention without any charge or trial. There's an article in the New York Times outlining the absolute horrific abuse they are undergoing on a daily basis. And if Hamas today were to carry out an incursion into Gaza, kill a couple of hundred Israelis, and then retrieve 4 Palestinians, would anyone in our discourse be celebrating this as some kind of victory? Would anyone even know the names of the 4 Palestinians who had been rescued from Israeli detention? We know the answer to that. And that's because we currently have a moment in which it's incredibly upsetting, the fact that we don't see Palestinian lives as equal or as deserving of the same kind of concern. And we carry on just accepting this mantra of Palestinians as collateral damage and a necessity, and continuing to treat the Israeli government as some kind of protagonist in this story, even though they are ultimately responsible for the situation in which we find ourselves in.
So when you hear the National Security Advisor Sullivan saying the preference is a ceasefire from this point forward, do you believe it's possible, and or do you believe that the release or rescue of more hostages can come without the cost of civilian lives?
Yeah, Frederica, it's even more than just civilian lives. The Israeli insistence on pursuing the release of hostages through purely military means has in fact killed far more Israeli hostages than they have rescued. And I'm talking about Israeli bullets and Israeli bombs that cost the lives of their own hostages. There is no question that a ceasefire and an agreement to exchange hostages is the only path forward in which you can guarantee the safety both of Israelis and Palestinians out of all this. We've seen the biggest number of hostages being released the last time there was a temporary ceasefire in which we agreed for an exchange of hostages and prisoners between the two sides. And that is obviously the path forward. There is currently a deal on the table that basically says, in exchange for the end of this war on Gaza that has just utterly devastated Gaza, killed nearly 40,000 people, in exchange for an end to that war, Israel can get all of its hostages back without another person being killed from this point moving forward. There is simply no reason not to accept that, except it seems that the Israeli government's goal of destroying Gaza seems to rank much higher than the lives of their own hostages, which is why we're stuck in this grotesque scenario. And it's why Netanyahu seems to be beholden to the fanatical wing of his own government, who are insisting that the ultimate goal has to be either the ethnic cleansing of Gaza or the permanent reoccupation of Gaza. And we're stuck in this situation where there is no real plan for what happens after this war. And in the meantime, people are going to continue to get killed. The fact that the United States, that the President Biden clearly has some tensions with Netanyahu. Unfortunately, those tensions have not led to any real or meaningful pressure. The only way President Biden can actually change Netanyahu's behavior is by credibly threatening to withhold U.S. military funding for Israel if Netanyahu does not change course. That, unfortunately, does not seem to be on the table. But I think Gantz is banking on that pressure ramping up moving forward and is trying to express a more clear and decisive disagreement with Netanyahu, hoping that when there is more mounting American and domestic Israeli pressure on Netanyahu, that he might potentially be there to essentially reap the benefits of that discontentment and take charge. But ultimately, really, we're stuck in a situation in which you need a ceasefire. That ceasefire can only be brought about through American meaningful pressure, and that has to mean that America cannot continue just providing unconditional military funding, knowing how these weapons are being used, knowing that every major human rights organization in the world is describing Israeli bombings in Gaza as indiscriminate, as costing too many civilian lives. That is not something that the United States should be complicit in. It's really way belatedly about time to say that we have to put an end to that kind of support in order to achieve that meaningful change, regardless of what Israeli Prime Minister happens to be in charge when that change comes about.